Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the YouTube channel where you get to watch a pair of talking hands. In this episode, we're going to be doing a valve adjustment on the 2003 Z1000. Before we get into that, a quick message. The Lonely Rider is not a professional mechanic and is not responsible for any personal injury or vehicle damage that may result from individuals attempting the repair shown in this video. You have been warned. Try at your own risk. Enough of that. Tools that you will need. You will need a socket set, including a spark plug socket, and preferably also a torque wrench, a shim kit for your bike, a good micrometer, a set of feeler gauges, a suction cup, all of the gaskets, the head cover gasket, this is the perimeter gasket, 4 of the internal spark plug gaskets, an O-ring gasket for the cam chain tensioner, gasket for the pulse cover. What's a pulse cover, you ask? See this guy right here? He's a pulse cover. And of course you also need some screwdrivers, pliers, other miscellaneous tools that you'll need along the way. And a good rubber mallet. And a set of metric Allen wrenches. Some scratch paper, calculator, or your smartphone, a pen. You will also need to make 2 charts for your valves that you're going to be adjusting. To begin, we're going to have to remove the seat to get access to the bolt to remove the gas tank. The bolt for the seat bracket down in there is a 10mm. With the seat off, we can now remove this bolt to get the gas tank off. This is a 12mm. If you have an aftermarket steering damper like you see I have, you're probably going to also have to remove that because it will just get in your way. So now that we got our gas tank lifted up, there are 4 lines we got to remove. We got to remove the fuel line going to the fuel pump. We got to remove this line right here, which just pops off. And then we got to remove 2 electrical lines as well. This one right here, you got to unhook that harness. And there's also a harness further back inside. I don't know if I can see it from this side. You got to unhook. You got to unhook that one as well. The fuel line you need to get to is that one right there, that plastic connector. You got to release that and pull it off. Okay, now this is going to be a little bit tricky, but this fuel line, these fuel lines are a pressure release style fuel line. I can't really show you with the camera, but there's gray buttons, one gray button on the top and a gray button directly on the bottom, and you have to squeeze both of those in and then pull it out. Okay, so I got the fuel line off. What I did was, see that gray piece on top there? There's also one on the bottom, and you got to squeeze those. And it was like this on the fuel line. So what I did, instead of having to buy some kind of tool, I just used a bolt, the top head of a bolt, and an Allen key, and I put the bolt underneath the bottom of it, and I put the Allen key on top of it, and I squeezed them together and pulled it off. And that actually did work. With all 4 of those lines unhooked, the gas tank should just lift right off. Carefully, of course. Next, we got to remove these radiator shrouds because they're going to be in our way. It looks like these are 4mm. One thing you might notice right away is if you have a stock bike, you're going to notice a difference here. You will have this guy sitting on top of the engine inside there like that. You're going to have to remove that system as well. You're going to have to unbolt each of these from the reed valves, unhook the vacuum line, and unhook the main line from your airbox. This is what's called the Kawasaki clean system. And what it did was it pulled in fresh oxygen from the airbox and shot it down into the exhaust to help burn off the, the harmful exhaust, save all the happy little trees. Unfortunately, when you tune your bike with a power commander, you have to get rid of that because that extra oxygen is, of course, going to confuse the oxygen sensor and make it leaner than it actually is. So as you can see, what I've done is people do when they tune the bikes is they put these block-off plates on instead. So in this case, I don't have this to get rid of, but you're going to have to get rid of that if you have that on there. And also you're going to have to remove at least this bolt here to pull this wire harness off. And same thing with the other side, there's also a bolt there for that wire harness. You're going to have to take that off as well. Next, you're going to want to unhook these wire harnesses here and here. Next, we're going to remove the spark plug coils. In order to do that, you want to number them left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, so you don't get your firing pattern all mixed up, and I usually just use a piece of masking tape to do that. After you do that, remove the spark plug coils. They just pop right off. Now when you number these, you got to remember that you need to actually number the connectors themselves, not the coils, because the 2 in the middle, you're going to have to take the connectors off of in order to get them out because it's a really tight space. So basically you have to unhook the connector and you have to kind of pull it up, tilt it to the side like that, tilt it to the side and kind of wiggle it out like that. It's a tight fit. Now this one's pretty hard, but in order to get this out of here without taking your line off, I actually removed this bolt here so that I can get a little bit of wiggle room on this thing, and I push this hose down in as far as I can. You gotta push it really hard and tilt this coil to get it out. And you should be able to get enough room, just enough room, to slide that puppy out of there. Now with all the coils unhooked, you should be able to slide this entire wiring harness for your coils out. That's why I told you it's important to mark the connectors, not the coils. With all the bolts off and everything free and out of the way, we are now going to tap it with a rubber hammer to release our head cover. It's going to be easier to take this head cover off by taking these screws actually all the way out, so they're not flopping around and getting in the way. Okay, what I'm probably going to have to do here to get this off without pulling the water lines off and getting antifreeze everywhere is I'm probably going to have to strap this line kind of up out of my way with a tie or something so I can get the head cover off. I also went ahead and took off those smog plates off of the reed valves to give me just a little bit more room, and I also went ahead and I actually unhooked the radiator mounts, one on this side, one on the other side, and that gave me the ability to pop off the radiator from the mounts and actually move the radiator and the hose up out of the way. And that should give us enough room to get the head cover out. So now again, we're going to lift the head cover up and we're going to slide it out this way because this side is wider than that side. So you want to pull it out this way. And there it is. Now in order to manually rotate the engine, we got to take the pulse cover off, and these are 8mm bolts. Pull the wire up out of the way and pop the cover off. Okay, and this gives us the ability to rotate the engine and also check for time. This is a 17mm. Now to manually rotate your engine, it's really quite simple. You simply put a ratchet on that and you can physically turn your engine over. Now your spark plugs are still in the engine, so of course you're still going to have compression strokes, so you're going to feel there are times when it's harder to turn the engine than others. That's called a compression stroke. Okay, so here is your cam, and this is a cam lobe, that little egg-shaped thing sticking out there. Underneath of that is actually called a bucket, and it looks like a bucket. Okay, so as your cam rotates around, that lobe pushes down on that bucket, which in turn pushes down on your valve, which is spring-loaded, and you can see the spring down in there. And that's what opens and closes the valve. So what we need to do with our feeler gauges for each set of valves in the engine, intake side, exhaust side, is we need to rotate the engine manually so that the pointy end of the lobe, this part right here, is pointing directly away from the bucket. So 90 degrees away from the bucket. And then get our feeler gauges underneath there to see if we can feel what the gap is between the cam and the valve. So the target gap, when you do this job, you need to make sure that you treat these sides separately, okay? When you check clearances and whatnot, when you go to replace shims and whatnot and do your math, do not do it in a zigzag fashion. You're supposed to do one whole row, one side, the intake side, and then switch over and do the other row, the exhaust side, because the target gaps from the intake side to the exhaust side are different. The intake side has a smaller gap. The exhaust side has a larger gap. And if you zigzag, you can get your math all messed up. So the best way to do this is to make yourself two sheets, okay? Make an intake side sheet and an exhaust side sheet with the target clearances written on them. Target clearances written on them by the service manual, and I'll put those in the description as well. And when you're doing this job, you will put one sheet away and focus on one row, the intake row, and you will just do that row. When you're done, then you will put that sheet away, get your exhaust sheet, and then do just the exhaust side so that you don't get your math messed up. Okay, now as you can see here, I've rotated the engine. Sorry, my light's flickering, the battery's getting low. I've rotated my engine so that the cam lobe is facing away from the bucket, and I'm going to use my feeler gauges. I'm going to slide the blade underneath there and see if it goes through or not. And in this case, it does not, which means that the gap is smaller than what this blade is, and this blade is a 0.152 millimeter. So that means that this valve is too tight, the gap is too small. So I'm going to try a smaller feeler blade to see if I can figure out exactly how small that gap is. Okay, so here's a 0.12 millimeter. and the 0.12 millimeter fits. So I know it's at least 0.127 millimeter gap, okay? So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a really small blade, and I'm gonna combine some blades to try to get as close as I can to the thickness that it will not go in any further. So I can combine a 0.1 and a 0.102 and a 0.038, which will give me exactly 0.14. And let's see if 0.14 will work. Okay, 0.14 works. Okay, so we know it's at least 0.14 millimeters. I'm going to use the metric system because it is just way easier. So I'm again going to try my 0.152. Maybe I just wasn't pushing it in right. Nope, the 0.152 will not do it. Okay, so 0.14 works. 0.152 does not work, and that's about as close as I can get with my feeler gauges. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to our cheat sheet here. We're going to put our exhaust sheet away. We're not even messing with the exhaust side right now. We're just doing the intake side. Okay, and we know that a 0.14 worked, a 0.152 did not. So I am guessing that the gap in there is somewhere around 0.145, approximately. You have to approximate. You're not going to get it precisely dead on with feeler gauges. Okay, and I'm going from the kickstand side over. So kickstand side over. Okay, so that was the first valve, and we're just going to repeat that process for every other valve. We're going to measure, and we're trying to find what the clearances currently are. So we're just going to keep going down the line just like you saw me do. We're going to go down through and check each one. Now the cam lobes, there are 2 valves a cylinder, so the next cam lobe is in the same position as the one I just did because they're in groups of 2. So I can go ahead and check that one as well. I'm going to get my 0.15 here. 0.15, and a 0.152 goes in effortlessly. So we know that the gap on this valve is larger than the gap on that valve. Now I'm going to go larger. I'm going to try a 178, a 0.178 millimeter. Okay, 0.178 will not go in. Okay, so I know it's somewhere between 0.15 and 0.17. Probably somewhere around 0.16. So I'm going to try to use my blades here. I'm going to try to build a 0.16, 0.127, and a 0.38. That will give me just slightly over 0.16. Okay, I'm going to try that. Okay, 0.16 fits. Okay, so 0.178 will not go in, but 0.165, it's 0.165 I'm building, will go in. That's about as close as I'm going to be able to get it. Okay, so 0.165 fits, 0.178 does not fit, so I'm going to guess it's somewhere around 0.17 even. So I'm going to say 0.17 even for that valve. And that's pretty much all you're going to do. I'm not going to bother showing all of the rest of it on camera. You're just going to go down through your whole intake side, and it's going to be tight to get inside there. You can actually buy feeler gauges that are angled, which is probably the ones I should have to do this, but they make ones that are bent so that you can slide them in there. But you're going to have to rotate your engine for each set of valves, pointing the lobe away. Get the largest feeler gauge in there that you can. Write down that approximation on your chart. We're just taking measurements right now. You're going to write all the numbers down for each valve, keeping track of which valves are which. Once you do the intake row, once you finish the intake row, you're going to switch gears and you're going to do the exhaust row. You're going to put your intake paper away and you're going to get your exhaust paper out, and you're going to do the exhaust row exactly the way that I showed you. Okay, now I have finished checking all of the valves with the feeler gauges, and I have written down all of the numbers. I've done the intake side, as you can see there, and I did the exhaust side, as you can see there. And it looks like They are pretty tight. It looks like all my measurements are pretty close to the lower end of the target range. They're all technically still in range except for this one and this one, but they're all at the very, very bottom end of the target range, which means they're getting a little tight and the gap's getting a little small. So we're still going to go through and adjust them all and get them a little closer to about 0.2, because the target for intake is 0.15 millimeter on this particular bike, and the top end of that is 0.24 millimeter. So in between those two is where you want to shoot, and I'm going to shoot for probably about 0.2. And then on the exhaust side, the target is 0.22 to 0.31. And as you can see, again, these are all closer except for maybe that one and maybe that one are closer to the lower end. So we're still going to go through and adjust those as well, because they're getting a little tight, and we're going to get them back into the middle. For this one, I'm probably going to shoot for maybe, probably about 2.6 or 2.8, somewhere around there. And we're just going to go through and we're going to adjust them. But again, we're going to do everything like we've been doing. We're going to do one side first, get everything in, and then we're going to do the other side because our targets are different and we don't want to get them mixed up. In order to get your engine into time to be disassembled, there are timing marks on these gears. There are 2 timing marks on this gear down here. Now these are numbered cylinders 1 and 4 and cylinders 2 and 3, okay? You don't use the 2-3 side, okay? T right there in a line and 1-4. That's the one you want to be lined up with. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little mark right here. It's actually where this casing goes together. There's a little line right there. That bottom end of that line. The line of the T for 0.14, which is cylinders 1-4, top dead center. That line needs to be lined up with that line on the case. And when that's lined up and you come up here to the cam, you see down in here there are lines. EX means exhaust, IN means intake. You see that there's a line on either of those right there. Those lines should be perfectly horizontal to the top of the engine case on both sides, okay? And now the engine is in time. So now it's ready to be disassembled, but before we do that, I'm going to do one more thing. I am also going to take a Sharpie, and I am going to mark, it doesn't matter which one, it doesn't matter. I'm going to mark a tooth on one of the gears, on each gear, and I'm going to mark the corresponding link that the tooth is in. So basically making myself a cheat sheet, so I know exactly what tooth of the sprocket goes into what part of the chain, so when I put them back in, I can get the time back into the right spot on the first try without having to do trial and error. So I'm going to reach up here and I'm going to pick one. I'm going to pick probably this one, and I'm going to mark the corresponding links as well. Okay, put another mark just in case my mark gets messed up. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm just going to pick one. Going to make a mark, see if you can see that. Okay, with the timing marks in the right position here, and with our cheat marks here, we are now ready to take off, to disassemble all of this, to take off the holders for the cam, take off the cam chain tensioner first. We're going to do that first, and then remove the camshafts. When you remove the cam chain tensioner, you do not want to try to remove the middle nut. You don't want to do that. You just want to remove the retaining nuts top and bottom. Those are 8 millimeters. So we're going to have to reset the ratcheting mechanism when we put this back in and retighten it back down to place, but we'll do that later. Now we have to remove all of the bolts holding the camshafts down. Those are all 10 millimeters. Okay, with the last of the bolts out, we can now remove these holders. Just lift them up and slide them out of the engine this way. Being gentle, of course. Okay, and you'll notice when you pull these out that they are marked. This one says intake side. This one says exhaust. Same thing with the camshafts themselves. They are different. They are not machined the same. They are machined different. And you can see that the exhaust shaft has this to read for RPM. With this on the exhaust camshaft, it should be a dead giveaway that that's the exhaust shaft. And you might have to pry it free from the actual shaft because it wants to stick to it. There we we go. So we're gonna get a tie, a zip tie or something, a rope or something, string something. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna tie the cam chain to something, in this case maybe the handlebar or something, just something, anything, to keep it up and keep it taut. When you pull the shafts out, you don't want this to fall down in the motor, or you don't want it to come off the teeth on the sprocket that's down here on the crankshaft either. So as you're doing this job, you want to keep the chain tight with one hand while you're removing the shafts with the other hand. In one smooth motion, set down, reach over, grab the other, sit down, and keep the chain with your left hand. After you get the shafts out, you're going to want to tie the chain up somewhere with something to keep it nice and tight, to keep it from falling down in the motor. So I went in and I got myself this old shoestring. I saved it because I knew that one day I would need this shoestring, and that day has come. Don't judge me. So I'm going to use this shoestring to tie up my cam chain somewhere on the bike. And I'm just going to wrap it up around the handlebar. Now with that tied up, we're going to lift up gently each shaft and slide it out of the head. We're going to start with the exhaust side. Okay. We're going to pop the chain off just like this. We're going to slide it out. Oop. Okay, now we're going to tighten this up a little bit. Because again, you don't want it to fall off the bottom sprocket. That would be very bad. There we go. Now we're going to lift up, same thing, the intake shaft. It's going to drip everywhere as well. Now it's very important, like I said, to keep the chain tight up against the bottom sprocket so it doesn't fall off. I'm just going to wrap it up. This is what the top end of your motor looks like without the camshafts in it. These are the buckets. We're going to pull those buckets out and get to the shims underneath of them and change the shim sizes. If you're wondering why my oil is very red looking, I am using Motul Full Easter Core oil. Great stuff. I highly recommend it. Okay, class, so now we're going to do some math. So now we're at the point of the job where we're going to be pulling the shims out, changing the shim size. Now here's what we got here. You got to get your shim kit out, get your micrometer out, get your suction cup tool out, get your chart out. We're going to be starting with the intake, of course. We're going to set the exhaust away. Forget about the exhaust. We're just going to do the intake first. Okay, so our clearance for this bike by the service manual is 0.15 millimeter to 0.24 millimeters. So I'm going to shoot for 0.20. I'm just going to go for the middle. Okay, so our first valve, we read it at 0.145. Okay, so now our target is going to be 0.20. Okay, for all of these. So we're going to take 0.2 minus 0.145. Okay, so that is the amount, 0.055. So that means we need to reduce whatever size shim is in this valve. We need to reduce it, okay, by 0.055. We need to make the shim in this valve, the shim needs to be 0.055 smaller than the one that's currently in there, which we don't know what size it is yet because we haven't pulled it out yet. So you're going to do that for every one of these. Okay, so first one, I'm going to get some oil on my finger, put it on my suction cup. We're going to suction cup this bucket right here and pull it out of the head. Okay, now sometimes, okay, you can have two situations. Sometimes the shim stays down in its seat down in there and you have to reach in there and pull it out, but sometimes it also sticks to the bottom side of the bucket, as you can see here. Okay, in either case, you just got to be careful lifting it out that you don't drop it down the engine. Okay, we got our bucket. Okay, we got our shim. We are going to mic out this shim to double check its thickness. So now we're going to get our micrometer. I'm going to turn our micrometer on. We're going to make sure we draw it in tight. Okay, and we're going to 0 it. So that's 0. Then we're going to back it out. We're going to put our shim in it. We've got to tilt it upright so it doesn't fall out. Okay, now when you draw it back in, use the larger knob because it has a slipper on it, and when it hits the object, it starts slipping immediately to try to give you an accurate reading. You don't want to use the small one. Okay, and we are at 3.02 exactly. So the current shim size is 3.02. Okay, now the math is really simple here. So again, our target, I'm going to go for the middle of these two, so my target's going to be 0.2 millimeters. We read about 0.145 millimeters of gap in there. It needs to be 2, so we need to make the shim smaller by 0.055. So that means that our shim, which is 3.02, it needs to be 2.965, or as close to that as what we can get. So you're going to go over to your shim kit. So I'm going to get a shim that is the closest to that size that I have. Looks like a 295 is the closest shim size that I've got. So we're going to use a 2.95. We're going to take our new shim carefully. We're going to place the shim in the shim seat, and then we're going to put some oil on the bucket and slide the bucket back down in. I'm going to see if I can do this. My light is still not working right. Just put the shim in just like that. Take your bucket, put a little bit of oil on it. Coat the outside of it nice with oil. Slide it back down in very carefully. Push it all the way down. Okay, and that's it. You've adjusted your first valve. Now, here's a tip. You don't throw away your old shims. They're still good. They're just a shim. But you got to remember what size it is, because if you don't have a size left in your kit for a valve you come to that you need, but you have one you pulled out of another valve that will give you what you need, then you can reuse the old shim. So keep your old shims and just write down what size they are. And that one is a 3.02. Okay, well, that took a long time, so I had to keep track of the sizes of all the shims I took out of the bike because I had to reuse some of them because I didn't have quite enough of each size from the kit. So I had to kind of work it around with some math to reuse some of the old ones from one side to the other side. So the math got a little crazy, but basically I got the valves adjusted. I got them closer in spec in the range. Some not quite as close as I would have wanted to, but they're all still within acceptable range, and the gaps are all larger than they used to be, so it's still a successful adjustment. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put our camshafts back in. I'm going to show you again how we're going to reverse that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exhaust side first. And again, I know this is the exhaust side because it has that little pin there for the RPM sensor. Now remember, we made ourselves a little cheat mark on here. We're going to line that up with this corresponding mark on the chain, which I can see is right there. You probably can't see it in the camera shot, but I can see is right there. So we're going to open this up and we're going to slide this on in. Okay. I'm going to rotate the shaft, put the tooth right on the mark that it left. Now at this point, we're going to have to loosen our strap because we need the slack back in the chain. So we're going to loosen our strap here. Put that back on. Maneuver this over to its slot right there. Now we got a hold of the chain now with one hand, so we can go ahead and just pull this strap the rest of the way off. We don't need it anymore. See how that was easy with a slip knot? Now we've got the chain, we got that mark lined up. Now we're going to put the other shaft in. We're going to line up the mark that we put on it, which will allow us to get everything back in time a lot faster. Okay, where's our cheat mark? Way off. There we go. And we're just going to sit that shaft right back into its spot. But see how I put the shafts with the tooth right back into the chain link that it came out of on both sides. So I know that the camshafts are exactly at the right position on the chain that they were before. Assuming that the chain did not come off the teeth, which I put this cover back on because it was leaking everywhere. Assuming that the teeth did not come off the bottom sprocket, it should be in time already, but we'll double check to make sure. But before we put that back in, before you tension up this chain, because once you tension up this chain, it's going to want to flip up these shafts without them being secured. So what you're going to want to do first is put the covers back on them first. Again, checking to make sure you got the right one. This is the exhaust side. Okay, so I put these back on. I snugged this side a little bit, but I left this side loose so I can get the chain slack out of this side. And I just laid my socket over here to keep the tension on this chain and keep the teeth from popping off. The way this cam chain tensioner works, okay, it's a ratcheting mechanism, okay, but it's got a clip on it, sort of like a caulking gun, that prevents it from going backwards, okay? It catches those teeth, okay, so it will come out, but it won't go back unless someone reaches in here and actually pulls the latch back, see that, and pushes it down in. Now you also have to draw this nut out because the nut applies pressure to this unit which pushes this out. So if I push it down in now, it's just going to come back out because I didn't loosen this nut. So this is a 12 millimeter. When you put this in, you're always supposed to have this ratchet, the teeth, facing up, okay? So the teeth and the mechanism are supposed to be facing up. This shaft that this bolt pushes on is spring-loaded, and so as you tighten this bolt, see how it automatically puts more pressure on it and it pushes out more as I tighten it in. See that? See how it's clicking out? Okay, so it will automatically adjust to take the chain slack out. Now the problem is you can release this latch and push it down in, but as long as this is screwed in, it's just going to pop back out. So to release all the pressure, you have to draw this bolt all the way out until the spring comes out, see that? And then you can release all of the pressure by pushing this all the way back in. And when you do that, it's going to want to push this all the way out. That's how you have to do it to push this all the way in. And then you're going to want to install this. You're going to want to mount the screws. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this in, take the chain slack out, put the mounting bolts on. I'm going to let that lay there to hold that down. Now I'm going to tighten those mounting bolts down, and when I do that, it's going to take even more of this chain slack out. But I left this bolt out because I don't want to put it on full pressure just yet. Okay, we got our tensioner back in. We did not tighten it down yet though. We got most of the slack out of the chain. Our timing marks up here. Get my flashing light for you. My timing marks up here is horizontal like it's supposed to be. Horizontal like it's supposed to be with the top of the engine casing. The marks we made to make sure the right tooth are in the right slots are there, and to make sure it's all still accurate, the timing mark on the crankshaft is still in the right position. So where it is right now, the cylinders 1 and 4 timing mark right in line with that line in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to tighten down the camshafts the rest of the way, tighten them all down, put this piece back on here, and then we're going to rotate the engine a few times to let the tensioner get tensioned up, and we're going to draw it back in so that it achieves full tension. So I've tightened up these bolts. I didn't torque them, tighten them. I just snugged them up with the wrench. I'll torque them later. And what we're going to do is we're going to carefully try to rotate the engine. We got the tensioner on. We just didn't tighten down all the way yet. But I'm going to tighten it down as we turn it, and we're just going to turn the motor and make sure that we don't feel any kind of resistance beside a compression stroke. But if it doesn't want to turn, don't force it. Back it off and try to backtrack and find out where you might have went wrong, because we don't want a collision. But we're going to try to turn it gently. And we should hear this ratchet a little bit as it's tightening up the chain slack. Okay, I can feel a compression stroke. Another compression stroke. Still turning fine. Drop it the rest of the way in. Tighten down the cam chain tensioner nut. Okay, time for some torque numbers by the service manual that I found online. The tensioner mounting bolts need to be tightened about 8 foot-pounds or so. The center bolt needs to be 21 foot-pounds. The cam bolts need to be 8.7 foot-pounds. And then when we put the valve cover back on, the valve cover bolts are 7 foot-pounds. So there you have it. Okay, now this is, at this point, I've torqued all the bolts down, I double checked them all. We're in time, it turns free, tensioner's back on. So now at this point, this is your last chance to go back through all of the valves with your feeler gauges and double check the clearances before you put everything back together again, because if you put everything back together again and one of them's way off and you damage your engine, well, you know, don't say I didn't warn you. So this is your last chance to go back through and double check your work. If you skip this step, it could be expensive. I'm going to do the spark plugs now because it's easier obviously to get to the spark plugs with all of this stuff out of the way than it is to do it with the cover still on the engine. So I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity. I'm going to change all the gaskets. I'm going to change the spark plugs one at a time, put my new spark plugs in, torque those down as well, and then reassemble everything, which is going to be a matter of reversing everything that you just saw. Okay, well, it looks like my spark plug socket's little rubber booty inside is not holding the spark plug like it's supposed to and pulling it out for me, so I'm gonna have to do it the hard way. There we go. It's more than one way to skin a cat. Now, one of these magnet tools really comes in handy. This is the spark plug that came out of it. I'm going to replace it with new Iridium spark plugs, which are supposed to be foul resistant. Before you put the spark plugs in, you have to remove the tips that come on the spark plugs, because the coil packs in this bike take this type of connector, not this one. So you got to take all of those tips off first. Install the new gaskets on the engine. Right down in there, over the dowel, the guide, and over the hole. Go ahead and do that for all 4 of them. Okay, so after you put all 4 new spark plug gaskets in, you are going to take the perimeter gasket off and replace it with the new perimeter gasket. Okay, I'm going to try to use my plastic automotive trim removal tools to get these off so I don't damage the surface of the engine in the process. But it looks like they're just cemented on, so I'm probably just going to have to dig them out pretty much. Yeah. Now you might see some cement residue left on the engine after you do that. So again, you're going to want to get like a plastic tool or something like that, nothing metal, and try to scrape that off. There we go. It's coming off. And then put the new gasket on. Now, with our surface prepped, we are ready to install the new gasket. Got to run along it with your finger, and you got to push it down on. Just reach back in there and make sure you got it seated everywhere. You don't want it crooked. Now we're going to get our head cover. We're going to go ahead and clean the surface of it off because it's undoubtedly very dirty. Okay, we've cleaned off the head cover, the outside and the inside, as well as the perimeter surface and the internal surfaces. So now we're ready to slide this back into the bike and bolt it back down. Okay, so we got the head cover on, we got it bolted down. From this point forward, I'm going to leave you on your own. I'm not going to bother recording the rest of this because at this point, it's just a matter of putting everything back in the way that you took it apart. You can go back to the video and watch that again. Two big things is just make sure you bolt that thermostat back down. Make sure you bolt your radiator back where it was supposed to be. When you put your spark plug coils back in, just make sure you get the numbering pattern correct for the firing pattern for your cylinders. I will show you guys this because it is really difficult. So basically, this coil right here is going to be the hardest son of a gun for you to get in and out in this entire project. The rest of them are easy, but this one, because the radiator hose is right in the way, and if you're trying to do this job without disconnecting the radiator lines, which is what I'm doing, this is going to be a pain for you. Basically, what I had to do is leave the radiator unbolted for now. I had to take the, as I showed you earlier, the bolt out of the mount for the thermostat housing, move that up, and I also went ahead and took that bolt out right there so that I have as much movement in this whole unit as possible. And what I had to do, and I'll give you kind of a demonstration with another coil, is I had to reach in here with my right hand, grab this hose, and pull it as far back as I could this way, out of the way this way, and then I had to slide the coil in like this, get it lined up and ready. Then I had to pull this hose out of the way and slide that down into the hole like that. That's what I had to do, and it was tight, but I managed to get it in there. When you put these coil packs in, you just slide them down in and just push on them really hard until it clicks down in. Okay, I lied. I'll show you this too, just because this is also really difficult to do. Unfortunately, unlike most modern sport bikes, this gas tank does not have a hinge mechanism at all, so you can't tilt it up or anywhere to get stuff. It just sits on the bike, which makes hooking things back up difficult. So what I do, and I just grab it and I lift it up and I put the bottom part down on that bracket, and that gives me the ability to reach in here, you see, and go ahead and connect all these things, all right, with one hand while I'm steadying it, and then as I tilt it down, fish the fuel line back in there to where it needs to go. And as always, we gotta finish the job with a startup test. And this is always the scariest part of the whole job. Fuel pump primed, I heard it. All right, let's crank it over. Give it a little choke. Check for any fuel leaks. No fuel leaks. No engine leaks of any kind.